The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, Jesus told his disciples a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him, saying, "Give me justice against my adversary." For a while he refused, but afterwards he said to himself, "Though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming." And the Lord said, "Hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It has happened to me, my dear friends, as a priest, when there are people who are confronted with, who are, for example, having someone suffering from cancer, we'll say. And as a family, they come together, they pray intensely for healing. They pray and pray and pray. Their only intention of prayer, in the intensity of the suffering, is that let our brother, our sister, our father or mother, let this person be healed of this terrible disease. But what happens? They pray and pray, and the person is dead. So then comes the question, why should we be praying? And is there any meaning in praying for something that we know that is not going to be useful? Is that having faith? Or is that an act of faith in God? Or are we to withdraw from prayer and accept things as they are? Today, my dear friends, the liturgy of the Word instructs all of us as to what we need to know when we are confronted with hard realities of life. Because in life, sometimes there is death or sickness or situations in life where we know that it is better or it is best to have a change, but it doesn't happen. Prayer doesn't change as well. The first reading taken from the book of Exodus tells us about a situation that arose for the people of Israel, which was seemingly impossible for them to overcome. What was this situation? The people had fled away from their land of slavery in Egypt. Their leader was Moses. Moses, of course, was inspired by God to go to them and bring them all together as a nation, though it was difficult. He was now leading the people away from their land of suffering to a land of freedom. And in this Middle Eastern world, they had to walk miles and miles through lands and territories that belonged to different tribes. Amalek was a leader of a tribe. Now, Amalek knew that all these people are now walking away from their slavery, and there is Moses. He was naturally afraid that they would come and take over his own territory. So the tribal war started. And the background to the text is, or the context of the text is that Moses knew that he did not have enough people to fight the Amalekites or the army that belonged to Amalek, the tribal leader. So now Moses had very good knowledge that his men were not soldiers because they were all slaves. Now they are also weary and worn out and had no much of a energy within themselves. But there was an inevitable war. So what does he do? He calls Joshua, the one who was with him, and tells him, there is going to be a war now. Amalek is now planning to wage war with us. What I want you to do is, you select a few people who are capable of war among the slaves. You go and fight them. But I will go to the mountain and I will start my prayer. And so therefore, Moses raised his hands. The more he raised his hands, the war was won. When the hands came down, the war was on the brink of losing. So now, of course, we have to remember that these are stories that are narrated to us in order to make us understand the truth of our faith than historical events. God was in their struggle. While they were doing what they had to do, that is Joshua and the others, they were out there fighting the war, Moses brought God's graces upon the struggle they had. So in other words, my dear friends, the message for us today is that in your life and in my life, there are situations where we would like to change, but they don't change. So are we to only pray and pray and pray? Are we to only fast and fast and fast and not do anything physically and concretely? No. The message is that we all have to make the best effort that we can with the limited resources, as Moses did. Only very few people. But they were out there fighting. But Moses brought in God's presence through his consistent prayer. So in your life and in my life, maybe there will be situations, or we have already had situations where we would love to change what is already there. We do not know how to change. But then the message is, go ahead and do what you have to do here and now, but at the same time, believe in prayer. Now, when you talk about prayer and faith in prayer, my dear friends, there is a wonderful saying in the tradition of the Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, Alcoholics Anonymous is a treatment modality for those who suffer from alcoholism. In the entire world, the research shows that the greatest number of recovery from alcoholism have to, before they talk about their story, they have to say, for example, if I am going into a alcoholics addicts meeting, and if I am an alcoholic, I have to say, I am Julian Patrick, and I am an addict, and I have no control over my addiction. Now, when you go through the process of talking about your difficulty in overcoming your problem, there is what you call the serenity prayer. And this is something that is being told to the group all the time. The prayer is, Lord, give me the courage to change that I can change. And give me the humility to understand the things that I cannot change. And give me the serenity of heart to know the difference. Give me the courage to change what I can change. Give me the humility to accept what I cannot change. And give me the serenity of heart to know the difference. So therefore, my dear friends, in your life and in my life, we all do have to have our own effort all the time. Maybe it is a cancer that your brother or your sister has. Maybe a marriage that you do not know how to overcome the difficulties. Maybe a sickness that is engulfing someone or the family. Maybe situations that you cannot just change at work. Maybe economic struggles that you do not know how to overcome. These are difficulties, challenges in life, which are sometimes beyond any change. But let us always be aware. Just as we do what we have to do concretely, let us also believe in persistent prayer. The second reading taken from the letter of St. Paul to Timothy. Now, Timothy was one of his own disciples whom he instructed in following the new faith of the risen Lord. When he writes to him, he says, "Continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you learn it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ." Now, Paul was someone who had gone through the sufferings in his life. Paul, in many places, writes that because I believe in Jesus Christ, I was never deprived, I was never kept away from difficulties and challenges. When you talk about Paul's life, Paul had enough enemies. Paul had enough trials in courts. Paul was beaten even very close to his own death. Paul was murdered. He was a man who had so many challenges in life. Just because he was a man of faith, his problems never got reduced. They, in fact, increased. But he says, in many places he says, "I am beaten, but I am never destroyed." Now, Paul knew in your life and in my life, deep down, there is the presence of God and active leading of God's Spirit deep within, in spite of what we have to go through. So Paul says, let us always remember, we will have challenges, we will have sicknesses, death, we will have problems that we can never sometimes understand how to overcome. But deep down, there is the hand of Christ. My dear friends, sometimes it's important in our own situations of life. Maybe it's a death, a sickness, a difficulty in a relationship. Deep down, there is always a meaning that is hidden, that we need to draw from. As Paul says, we will have problems, we will have difficulties, but there is always the meaning that is hidden. Now, when you come to the gospel passage, again, Jesus is giving his own disciples a parable in order to highlight and emphasize the importance of persistent prayer. So there we have the story of a judge, as Jesus says, someone who never cared about human beings. Judge who didn't care for the law. A judge who didn't want to do justice, give justice to his clients or people. So Jesus says, even if you have a man who is not concerned and conscious of doing what is right, if you go on doing and persisting, at least sometime along the line, justice will come your way. So when you listen to the parable, you can see that Jesus says to his own disciples, yes, sometimes life doesn't go the way that we want, but deep down, God's presence and God's wisdom is always there. It will happen at the time, not necessarily our time, not the way that we want, but God's justice will always come to us. Now, my dear friends, when you talk about the entire question of praying for impossible situations in life, there is a wonderful book written by a rabbi, Robert Blue, a Jewish man who was a child during the Second World War. He writes about his own experience as a child in the concentration camps. He says, I saw my own father, my own mother, my entire family caught up in the concentration camps. We knew that the time of death is going to come. He says, I have been a man of faith for so many years. I have never seen people praying so sincerely, so hard when they knew that their death was coming. He writes, as a child I saw how my Jewish elders were fasting and fasting and fasting and praying. I saw some of them kneeling and kneeling and kneeling and praying. But what happened to them? All of them were killed. All of them were massacred. So he says, when you think of prayer, we always have to remember that the more you pray, sometimes what you pray for doesn't happen, but the opposite happens. But he now, as a preacher, he says, what I have seen is that we pray for what is impossible. What is impossible will always be impossible. But what happens through prayer is that we learn how to face which is impossible. So he says, the more they prayed, more able they were to stand up when the time came. The numbers were announced. Come up now, you will be shot to death. Those who prayed harder, those who prayed fasting, those who prayed kneeling down, those who prayed so intensely were the ones who were able to stand up and say, yes, I'm willing. Those who did not pray for survival were so scared they almost died when the name was or the number was called out. So therefore he says, prayer is not necessarily that you change a situation, but it changes you to face a situation that is impossible to face. My dear friends, prayer, therefore, is the only way when we are confronted with situations that are beyond our control. Prayer may not necessarily bring the changes that we desire, but it will change us from within to face what is impossible.